On October 16, 1962, President John F. Kennedy was shown aerial photographs taken by a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. The images were unmistakable. Soviet nuclear missile sites were under construction 90 miles from the coast of Florida. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union stood at the edge of nuclear war. It remains the closest the world has ever come to destroying itself. The crisis did not begin on that October morning. It was the product of years of Cold War tension, ideological rivalry, and dangerous miscalculation. The Soviet Union, led by Nikita Khrushchev, had watched the United States surround it with nuclear missile bases in Turkey and Western Europe. Cuba, meanwhile, had become a communist state under Fidel Castro following the revolution of 1959. When Kennedy authorized the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, Khrushchev concluded that the Americans would stop at nothing to remove Castro. He proposed a solution: place Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuban soil. They would deter any American attack and, in one move, equalize the strategic balance. Castro agreed. Construction began in secret in the summer of 1962. The U-2 photographs changed everything. Kennedy convened a secret advisory group called ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. For 7 days, its members debated options behind closed doors while the administration maintained a public face of normality. The options ranged from a diplomatic approach to a full military invasion. The Joint Chiefs of Staff pressed for airstrikes and an invasion. Kennedy resisted. He had read the history of the First World War and understood how miscalculation could ignite a conflict no one intended to start. On October 22, Kennedy addressed the American public. He revealed the existence of the missiles, demanded their removal, and announced a naval blockade, which his administration called a quarantine to avoid the legal implications of an act of war. He made clear that any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response. The world held its breath. Soviet ships carrying military supplies were already at sea, bound for Cuba. On October 24, they approached the quarantine line. The question was simple and terrifying: would they turn back or attempt to run the blockade? Kennedy's Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, later recalled those hours. He said that they were eyeball to eyeball and somebody had to blink. The Soviet ships slowed, stopped, and turned around. The immediate crisis at sea had passed, but the missiles in Cuba remained. Behind the public confrontation, a secret back-channel negotiation was underway. Khrushchev sent 2 letters to Kennedy, one conciliatory, one more demanding. Kennedy chose to respond only to the first. Attorney General Robert Kennedy met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. The outline of a deal took shape. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. The Americans would pledge never to invade Cuba and would quietly remove their Jupiter missiles from Turkey, a concession kept secret from the public for 25 years. On October 28, Khrushchev announced the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. The crisis was over. The aftermath reshaped the Cold War. Both sides had been shaken by how close they had come to catastrophe. Direct communication between Washington and Moscow had been dangerously slow during the crisis. Messages took hours to arrive through diplomatic channels. Within a year, a direct telephone hotline was established between the two capitals. The Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963 prohibited nuclear testing in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. The crisis had proved that the two superpowers, for all their rivalry, shared a common interest in survival. The Cuban Missile Crisis also left deep lessons about the nature of nuclear deterrence. It demonstrated that the doctrine of mutually assured destruction was real, that both sides understood the consequences of escalation and ultimately chose restraint. But it also revealed how close the world could come to annihilation through a combination of miscalculation, incomplete information, and institutional pressures toward escalation. We now know that at the height of the crisis, a Soviet submarine commander nearly launched a nuclear torpedo after losing contact with Moscow and concluding that war had begun. His executive officer refused to authorize the launch. One man's judgment prevented a catastrophe. The 13 days of October 1962 showed that the most dangerous moments in history are not always the result of malice. They are often the result of fear, pride, and the terrifying gap between what leaders intend and what their adversaries believe. The missiles are long gone from Cuba. The Cold War ended 30 years ago, but the lesson of those 13 days has not expired. In a world that still possesses thousands of nuclear weapons, the margin between a crisis and a catastrophe remains as thin as one man's decision.